hand it over to our first presenter this evening, architect Prashant Pole. Over to you, sir.
Good evening, everybody. Wonderful to be here in Pune for the first time. Amongst people that you've known so well, all my life at least. There's Mohi sir sitting there and Girish sir sitting there and Pushkar sir in the audience. I mean, one couldn't have asked for more. I am as jittery as the students sitting there in the first row right now. I'll come to why that is important a little later. In the context of this TDB competition, the drawing board competition, I thought it only made sense to pick up threads from what this competition was all about, given the fact that it was located in a place like Badami with such fantastic architectural heritage, having myself been involved in that region, working for 20-25 years in places close to Hampi and similar historical background and sites which are close to that region. I understand the complexity and the task at hand which the students must have faced while handling such a interesting, at the same time such a difficult site. So given that, I thought I'll probably take it from there. I'm sorry if this talk is a little oriented towards the students and not to the first two rows. I may oversimplify a few things, but that is purely for the students in the audience. And I'm sure most of you agree, and most students here would be in concurrence with the idea that when you look at an empty sheet of paper in front of you, the first question which most of us, even now, ask ourselves is, where do you start? What is that first line? What is that first sketch? What is that first idea? Where do you begin this damn thing, this empty sheet of paper staring at you in the face? In the writer's language, it's called the writer's block. You look at an empty sheet of paper and what is the first word you type? And here it is, what is the first line that you draw? And having been in academics for quite some time now, with students, the first thing that you always talk to them in the first semester, second semester is that please understand the difference between why you are learning to be an architect and why you are not learning to be an artist or a sculptor. And if you understand that, I think a lot of these issues kind of get resolved, because this is probably the only art form which people live in. And that is your basic difference, and that is where the story starts. The minute you realize you create magic in which people are then supposed to live their lives, play there, study there, have fun there, recreate there, do whatever that they do, is all in these wonderful spaces that you and I will end up creating during our lifetimes. And that is what makes this profession so different from the rest of the arts, basically because that is where most of your keys are. That is where most of your starting points are. It's finally people, it's finally associations, it's finally all the things that you do which makes this magic happen. So I named this talk the idea of the continuum, because there is nothing in architecture which can stand by itself as as something out there in space, out there in open, with no continuity of any kind. There is always something that you're continuing. And what do you continue would depend from project to project. It's not necessarily the same thread of thought which would move from project to project. Every project has its own cues. I have only two projects to show, and both of them are in this similar context of having to build with something which already existed. And then how does one continue from there on? This is a small residence in a place called Kumta. Mohi sir would be aware of this place because his ex-boss, Mrs. Chandavarkar, if I'm not wrong, comes from this town called Kumta. So if you look at it, Kumta is a small town. Up is Gokarna, Karwar, and then Goa. And then you go down, it's Mangalore. So it's on the coast, a very small, sleepy town. And the site is somewhere there, and the road from the site kind of leads you straight down to the river there. And when it rains, and every year, obviously it rains pretty high in the coastal areas, this river floods and comes all the way up to the house. So all these paddy fields, everything gets inundated, and the cattle and all the sheep and everything else from these farms, they all come and tie them up in the house of this owner. And it's an interesting story because I didn't know this client personally, and a contractor friend put me on to them, and he had been pursuing this for almost 2 years, saying that there's this job I have to do, and can you come and please help me do this? I said, and one used to wonder then, for a 2-bedroom house, do I have to travel 10 hours and go to this place and start this work? And he said, it's a clean site, you don't have to worry, it's a small job. Even if you send drawings, I'll manage it. Then finally I said, okay, let's go have a look at this place. So we went and saw this small house which he said, which we were supposed to do. And it turned out to be a interesting complex. This is the site. There's a small narrow lane which comes from a road which is somewhere there. That lane kind of brings you into this. There is a small family, so it's a family property, and they are like the village landlords. In Kumta they are called Shanbags, like you call them Patils here and you call them Gaudas in Karnataka. They are called Shanbags in Kumta, and they are basically landlords who own properties in and around the region, and they are a family of about 200 people who live in that region. And this is their family property, so this is their family temple, a family old house, and this is the house that they were living in right now. The story is very interesting because the father of this person, the client of mine, was a bank employee in Bombay. Husband and wife worked in Bombay, retired, came back and settled down in the village. Took up their landlordship a little more seriously and started cultivating the land, and people would start coming home and stuff like that. And his intention was that this is the plot of land that I own, the rest belongs to relatives and friends, and this is the house which is there, and that house is supposed to go. So you have a property which is that big, and we need a house for grandparents, 2 of them, and he, his wife, and his son. And there's a small well there, and there's a shrine here which all the villagers come and still pray in that shrine. So you can't call it a private space, and it's still not a fully public space because they're village headmen, everybody comes to their house, so that's part of their story. So that's the walk from the road which kind of takes you into the property. That's the family temple. That's an old house which is a defunct property, nobody lives there. And that's the house which they were living in. So it's got a veranda there, there's another veranda. These verandas come up during the monsoon and they vanish after the monsoons go. And the house itself was not a G+1, it's a ground floor structure and an attic on top, basically to store grain. And somewhere at the back they had added an extra shelter to house the kitchen. So if you look at the plan of the house which we measured up, that part of the house is the old house, which is the 2-stepped veranda, walks into a small living room, another small room there, and a big puja room. This was an ad hoc structure put up in the last 15-20 years, which was the kitchen, the wash, and place to keep the firewood, the open well there, and the shrine. When you look back from between the 2 houses towards the road, that's a shrine where the villagers and the family members come and pray. And that's the yard where the well is, the shrine, and a small bathroom and kitchen addition which had happened to the house. That's the kitchen addition with a firewood shed and some kind of tin sheet there, a little bit of tile there, and that the old house sits there. That's the well. And that's a 2-stepped veranda which is in the front. Now, because he's the headman, he handles the labor. People who come from the villages or from the fields, and every week you hand out payments to them and you do all that work. All that happens in the veranda. Is the living room of the house. That's the puja room, which is the biggest room in the house. And that's the kitchen cum dining space with a little light coming from top, and that's the kind of space that they had. The problem with most old houses, they look great from the outside, but people didn't have money for wood. People didn't know how to make openings in these thick walls, which were about 2 feet thick. So openings would normally be small, and the spaces inside would be literally very dark and dingy. This is the attic on top, which is mostly used for storage. So the story starts from, what do you continue from a project like this? Where are the threads? And within a week or 2 weeks, phone calls start coming saying that, what have you decided? Are you planning to demolish the house? And what we would like to see plans and stuff like that. So I saw this place, went back, talked to his parents, talked to him. First time meeting this client, and went back to Bangalore. I said, I want to come back again. I went back again spent a day with the family, and then realized that it's a very traditional kind of setup. The parents, this is that Tulsi thing in front of the house. This is the client and his wife. And it's a very traditional kind of a setup because, of course, being the village headman, there is a certain responsibility that you have towards the community. And what I found interesting was, the old couple had come back because they had retired. Now, this man started a silicon factory in Bangalore, in the industrial area in Bangalore, and was doing pretty well for himself, lived in Bangalore. But within a year after his parents moved to the village, he decided that he would set up another factory in the village for the villagers so that they could work in that second plant, so that the villagers also have some work to do on his new factory. So he set up a factory in the village. So he was running 2 factories, one in the village and one here. Within 6 months, he had moved to the village. So his family also uprooted themselves from Bangalore and shifted back to the village. So there was this nagging thing running in the head saying that there is this sense of continuity which a family is trying to put together some ways. There is generation 3 passing on something to generation 2. Generation 2 is taking their role also seriously in the whole process, and some of it is being rubbed on to the son, who is now generation 1. Now in a situation like this, if you had to reinterpret the entire story, I thought the best thing would probably be to re-look at this whole idea of why do we need to demolish the house. Because that is also part of this idea of continuity. Because if one generation is passing on something to the next and somebody is carrying on that legacy in some ways, isn't it our duty also to then re-examine what the physical envelope then is? And then we seriously did an examination of what the physical envelope was and realized that the building was not bad. It was not falling apart. It was not breaking. There were no cracks. The plaster had not come off. Laterite stone, 2 feet thick, extremely well preserved. The wood in the ceilings was also in perfect condition. So there was absolutely no reason why the building had to come down. So we had to convince them. It took almost 2 days of sitting with them to convince them, saying that probably it makes sense that you keep the building and then we see what we do along with that. And the old man had tears in his eyes. He said that, I didn't want to tell you this, though you are the architect, you are the engineer, you know better. I didn't want to tell you this in the beginning, saying that do something so that we could have this, because honestly, I also don't know who built this house, whether it was my father or my grandfather or my great-grandfather. So there is no history of who actually built the house also. So it must be 150 years old is what he says, but that is also a guesstimate. He's also not sure about it. So with that, we started this whole story of how do we re-examine the whole thing. So I'll quickly run through the whole, through the idea. We kept the house, and we knocked the extension, which was the kitchen, and the ad hoc addition that was there at the back. So the idea was, as a structure for the family, you have his space, that is the father's space, where he sits and meets the workers and distributes their wages, which is a weekly activity every Saturday, Sunday. And that's his space. This is her space. That is where the kitchen, the utility and all that was arranged, so that the ladies of the house come out there, the well, the shrine, the puja around it, the vendors who come and sell stuff, vegetables, fish and stuff like that, all that activity happens here. So that becomes the women's space, this becomes the men's space, and then you cut across, and we did a small courtyard within the house, around which then the new house was planned, so that becomes our space. Basically 3 kinds of spaces, which are basically open spaces. One is for what happens as business, one is what happens as housework, and one is then what happens between the families. There are 2 bedrooms at the back, and a backyard where you have coconut and jackfruit and all the regular kitchen garden trees, a small dining space. The puja room, the only change we did in the existing house was there was a wall in the middle here, which divided the puja room from the hall in the front. We knocked that wall off. It took almost a 2-month effort to figure out how to break that wall and still retain the original structure. That's a different story. I will not get into that right now. But having knocked that, that opened up the idea of a living room, which then opened onto a court. And that public space then has no access to what happens to the rear of the house. You only get to see the puja room, which is now shifted there. So that it has a direct access to the puja room, but the rest of the house is not visible. In the first floor, you have the same 2 bedrooms with a study for the son, and the master bedroom comes to the front because he wanted to see who comes to his house during the day. So as a section, it's a very simple section. The right-hand side wall is a continuous wall, which is this one. This is a gable in the front. That gable extends and becomes a larger gable when it comes to the back, and then it breaks into 2 and then allows for a water tank to sit on the top. So it's basically one roof which kind of continues right through, and this is done in metal. So what happened was we allowed for the verandas to remain the way they are. We added an additional veranda around the court. This small partition is still to happen to make that court a little more private. The veranda on top becomes a sit-out for the owner to see who's come to the house and the functions of the other activities that happen in the house. And that's the 2 verandas now. That's the veranda where the old man sits, listens and talks to his constituents or the people who work in his farm. And that moves into the living space as you walk from the veranda into the living space. That is where the wall was, in middle there. That wall went. So the original windows and this, whatever was there in the existing house remained as it is. We didn't change the lintels, we didn't break any extra walls, because any breaking of the wall would damage the structure in some way. So we didn't do anything with the openings. We just increased the height of the openings so that the amount of light coming in was a little more than what it was. So that became the living space, which then opens on to the courtyard there. So you see the living space opening onto the courtyard, and there at the end is the puja room. You don't see the rest of the house, what is happening in the rest of the house there. And that opens up into the courtyard in the middle, which has this, the masonry stops at a particular level. After that, it's the metal and the underdecking, which kind of takes up the roof. It's an insulated roof, so that takes care of the sun. And that looks back into the living space on one side, and the office where the father sits and does accounts and stuff like that of what is happening on his land. To the right is the dining space, which kind of creates that connection between the living, dining, and the court, the opening onto the family on top and the master bedroom there on top. So it's a very simple organization, but the idea was that to do something like this, and also to allow them to pick their own furniture. As architects, we'd have this tendency to kind of look at every small piece that goes into the space that we design. Here I left it to his best judgment. I said, I don't think you'll go wrong in whatever you pick. And though it looks eclectic in the urban scenario, but in that house it fits well. So I said, fine, leave it. That's the master bedroom with opening onto the sit out in the front, the gable roof. The furniture is all picked by the owners. And that frames the house opposite where they were staying when this house was being done. So they had temporarily modified that house and had moved into that space, and now they moved back into this space now. And that's how the courtyard normally gets used, because it's a Brahmin family. A lot of pujas and lot of other things which happen in the house. So that courtyard becomes the space where the entire family comes. He's also got two sisters, so one stays in Goa, one stays in Bangalore. So every month there is something or other happening. So the courtyard becomes the space where the entire family kind of gathers together. So it's one single roof which kind of covers the whole thing and increases to take on the gable on the other side. So the idea was the original wall remained as it is, and the new house kind of then comes out of the old house. So the wall was not purposely kept continuous. We pushed it behind so that you know what was new and what was the old. So this was story number one, where one was looking at continuing this act of what a family holds dear to them, what makes the family function, and you as an architect, where do you fit in to catch that thread from there and figure out it's got nothing to do with the architecture of the place, it's got nothing to do with the buildings or the style or any of the standard, how do you say, studies that one ends up doing to figure out how to build next to the old. The only study that was there was to understand the people who were trying to build there. This is another story. This is the story of our school. My students are already smiling there. And this story is interesting because a lot of people related to the story are sitting here in this hall. And I can very confidently say that without these people sitting here in this hall, this story would not have been told. There is Mohesh sir sitting here, and there is Pushkar sir sitting here. I mean, without these people, I don't think this school would have even existed. The kind of help and the kind of effort that they put in to see that this school happened was unbelievable. Now, this is a different story. This is a different story of continuity. And it started with one chance meeting with this great man called Mr. Balkrishna Doshi. I was presenting in Ahmedabad and I'd taken my whole office to Ahmedabad. We ended up visiting him at his home. Very casually asked, what is happening in Bangalore now? I used to come there when IIM was being built, and we used to meet. There was this base gang, Sanjay sir, Kanades, and 10, 12 people, whom Edgar, so many of them whom we used to meet at that time. And once IIM finished, those visits stopped and the meetings also stopped. So is there anything else that you guys are doing? So I said, our generation is still not into it. We are still busy setting up our practices and finding work for ourselves. So nothing in that front seems to be happening. And then he said, see, it's our responsibility not to just look at what we do as architects in terms of our practice. It's also our responsibility to build associations. Now, that word didn't strike that well then. It took some time to understand what exactly was it trying to mean. And then we came back from the trip, and within a month after coming back from that, was in December of 2007, if I'm not wrong, and sometime in January, February 2008, we founded this association called MASA, Malnad Architecture School Alumni. We are all part of a school which ceased to exist in 2000. So we produced 20 batches of students, and like Feed, here in Pune, who's been doing this amazing work for the last 20 years, 200 and odd events. We started this alumni association in 2007, and it's already 2023, and we have done 150 events. We do event per month with a speaker, and been continuously doing it for the last 17 and odd years. There's an annual event like this which happens every year where we bring in speakers from all over the world. And the annual event for the coming year is on January 20th, 2023. So this is something which we started on the side, saying that it is also a responsibility at some level to not just talk architecture and do architecture, but also inspire people, especially students and younger architects who are in the profession, to look at this dialogue a little more seriously and expose them, give them a platform to show their work and see work which is new and inspiring. This was a continuum of a different kind. This is the continuity of an idea which talks about an architect doesn't only build structures or buildings. You also build so many other things. You also build relationships. And every project that you do is a relationship that you build with a client, with a contractor, with the team of people that you work with. And those relationships are sometimes for a lifetime. And sometimes all of us, most architects here will agree that not all our projects turn out the way they do. And you value projects which have turned out well because you believe that the clients there or something there clicked so well which made that project the way it was. So finally it comes back to those associations of people, of what that association means, which then leads to something much more meaningful. So with that, we moved into this next stage of, after having done 17 years of MASA, people were asking, you need to do more. And this conversation with Doshi also set off this ball of thought, saying that all of us are in education, have been teaching in various schools and colleges. It's time we seriously took this up, and 10 of us got together to decide to start a school of architecture in Mysore. And we were fortunate to be associated with the Queen of Mysore. Now, why this is important? Because this is another story of continuity. This man, His Highness Krishnaraj Wadiyar, between 1884 and 1940, not a long innings. He died by the time he was 58. He ruled for only about 20 and odd years, but he is credited with having made all the educational institutions in Karnataka. The Indian Institute of Science, the Mysore University campus, the Agriculture University campus, Raman Institute in Bangalore, every educational institute in Karnataka owes a huge debt to what happened during his time. He wanted to put Karnataka on the map of the country, saying a state which can do so much with education, and he spent his entire life wanting to do that. Her Highness, who is now the present Queen of Mysore, wanted to continue that legacy, the legacy of wanting to pass on education or want to do something with education for the state of Karnataka. So when we approached her, she said, I had something like this in mind when you guys came, that I wanted to dabble something to do with design, but I didn't know it was architecture. But now that you've come, let's see what we can do. So she gave us this property, which is about a 10-acre property, out of which the council asked us to have 2 acres. So we had earmarked 2 acres, which had these 3 existing buildings. One was a hostel, in which these small rooms, 10 feet by 10 feet rooms, were rooms where 3 students were staying together. So three in each room, 3 on this side, 3 on that side, and 2 halls where there were 5 students, a staircase in the middle, and a corridor in the front, and it was approached from the road. Back there is a courtyard, or a space. It wasn't a courtyard, it was a space between 2 buildings where that was the classroom block, and a shed at the back. This is what she showed us, saying that I have this plot of land, if you want to do something with this, you are welcome to. So when we went there, this was the state the buildings were in. None of the buildings had been occupied for almost 25 years. The building in the front is 75 years old. The building at the back is 120 years old. And we were asked to put up, or we decided to start our School of Architecture here. Now again, I go back to the clean slate and where to draw the first line. Easy to pick up the internet and look at the best architecture schools in the world. There are so many. You can start with CEPT, you can start with SPA. There are umpteen number of schools to learn from. But that was something I resisted from doing. I said, that is one thing I'll not do. Open and check how the rest of the schools in the world are planned. And went back, sat on the board, looked at that empty sheet of paper and said, what is it that one is looking at when you're looking at these buildings, and the story of this king, and the story of this whole story about furthering this act of education. How does, and you're into this now as a group of 10 friends, wanting to do something with education, in this case, the education of architecture. And sitting there and thinking about this, the thought which immediately came to mind was that the buildings have nothing to say architecturally. They're old. I remember a wonderful saying which somebody, two old men walking past, and a young boy accidentally bumped into one of the old man, and he didn't say anything and walked off. So the guy called him and said, don't you realize that you're supposed to be respectful to an old person? And he scolded that boy, and the boy left. The friend then tells him that there's a difference. One can be old or one can be wise. Do you want to be old or do you want to be wise? Do you want to be respected because you're old because of age, or do you want to be respected because you're wise because of age? Now, these were buildings which we were not sure whether they were old or wise. So we took the cue that they're old. Fair enough. We don't destroy them because they're old. But the wisdom here was what the kings had left. This whole act of wanting to educate, or that notion or the will to want to do something more with the state, and that notion or that idea was more powerful than what the buildings were telling us. So with that in mind, and this is the space in between, this is for the kids here who haven't seen these photographs. This is what was in between the two buildings. And the buildings, I'll tell you what we did with the buildings later, but yeah. The only thing we did was the front building, we made it turn itself backwards. The corridor in the front was added at the back. So the building now faces back instead of looking towards the front. And the whole idea of wanting to build in steel came out of this whole fact that these are buildings in masonry which have been done by these kings and which have lasted hundreds of years. From an idea which is also a century old, we are newbies. We are a set of 10 people wanting to start a department of architecture, which is not even 300, 400 students, where you're trying to look at a legacy of somebody who's left behind universities which are teaching thousands and thousands of students. So what is your contribution in a space like that? It is minuscule. And with all humility, one would then want to put in a structure which would sit so lightly there and not offend the buildings that were there. And not compete in any way, not offend in any way, and sit as quietly and as lightly as possible next to what is already existing. So what we did was, of course, we reversed the corridor and only turned the doors and windows inwards. What was outside came inside, and what was windows inside went to the walls on the outside. So the corridor was added. The central block became the library, which was in that state, actually in that state. 120-year-old building, all the tiles had gone, the walls were cracking, plants were growing in the walls, plaster had fallen off, couldn't touch any of the openings, couldn't touch any of the walls because they're all in mud mortar. So the only thing that we did was remove the roof. The whole issue was that the roof was leaking. So the roof had to be done well. So we did the roof properly, rebattened the whole thing, and that's how it looked. Added skylights to all the spaces because it's a library now, you need light coming in. So that's the corridor now, and that's the library there. And that became the courtyard between the two buildings, which is that now. So with this, we started a school of architecture. We had two old buildings, we had a courtyard which we had done, and we added a corridor. That's it. We had nothing new to show. We had no classrooms, we had no studios, we had nothing. And I remember Pushkar sir coming for the first inspection and saying that, you sure you're going to manage with this? I said, sir, look at the people, forget the buildings. And he said, exactly. I mean, if 10 of you have this will to want to do this, I don't think the rest of it matters. It is that energy and the will that the 10 of you have which will pull this through. And thanks to you, sir. It's 10 years now, 4 batches have passed out, and we're doing great. So with that, then we started adding, one structure came up on the side. Now the idea of continuity moves to the idea of confidence in terms of how you can build with steel, because none of us had built with steel before. All of us are used to RCC and brick by default setting. I mean, before you open your sheet, you already start thinking it's going to be a concrete building, it's going to be walls and brick and stuff like that. And the minute you realize that you're going to be building in steel, we started with simple spans of 5 meters by 5 meters and then looking at how the whole thing works. So the idea was it would be masonry at the lower level and a drywall construction at the upper level. So the system of building was entirely in hollow tubes. No I sections, no C sections, no cold rolled sections basically, only tubular sections. So the idea was we didn't have the money, it had to be a lightweight structure, but we were putting our own money to make these buildings. We are still repaying those loans. It's 10 years gone, but that's okay. The idea was that it would be as light as possible so that it would not, of course, not sit heavily on the ground was one thing, not offend the existing buildings, which was the second thing. And the third, at some point of time, the Queen had written a note in her agreement saying that if at some point I ask you to return the buildings back, you should be able to give me my buildings back the way they were. So we said, we'll not touch your buildings, and whatever we have, we'll take it back. So the idea of salvaging something out of, somebody talks sustainability and stuff like that, but this is not, it didn't come out of the idea of sustainability. It came out of the idea that if I have to demolish this building, can I take the whole thing back? So we started with the idea of actually bolting and working out details where you could actually nut bolt this building and take it out. But then that didn't happen because we didn't have that kind of labor available in Mysore. So anyway, long thing short, it became an extremely light two column structure, 5 inches by 5 inches, 125 by 125 with a 125 purlin on top, which then was added with a steel tension rod, that one, with a decking sheet on top of that, a truss sitting on top of that, masonry only at the lower level, upper levels becomes, then there was this huge debate on, it will look extremely industrial, it will look like a workshop, it will look like a garage, it will look like this, it will look like that, it will not look like a school. A lot of people fighting, even amongst the 10 of us, saying that this is not doable. I mean, this is too dry, too mechanical, too industrial. I said that there are ways to solve that. Let's see how to do it. So we brought in this idea of pine wood. And the pine wood on the inside then became all the walls, which then kind of move, collapse, do all the stuff that is required, so that sometimes you open up the whole thing, sometimes you keep it, and the space then transforms itself in terms of what it does. That's the skylight on top. And you can open up all the doors, and the entire studio then opens up to the courtyard. So it depends on the time of the day. Sometimes you want studios flowing out, sometimes you want to close them. So the idea was that as a place for learning, which was another quote from Korea which came up in one of his books, Place in the Shade, if I'm not wrong, where he says that architecture is a subject which you can't teach, but architecture is definitely a subject which you can learn. Now that was one line which I picked from there, saying that if this has to be a place for learning and not a place for teaching, then how does one look at it? Then everything here should be where a student has to learn from it. Nothing is taken for granted. A wall is not a wall, a window is not a window, a door is not a door. You question everything. You question every act of every element that you learn in a BC class or in a design class, and you put it to test and say, does it work the way you learn it, or can you do something more with it? Then a third block happened, continuity in terms of structure. We became a little more bolder. Spans increased from 5 meters to 8 meters. Now the column becomes a mushroom. It almost behaves like a flat slab. That's the building at the back there. And those are the studios. Columns run through the studios. It's okay if there are columns in the studios. There's a big debate on that. Can we have columns in the space? I say, what's wrong with columns in the space? People will sit around it. People will even find ways to use those columns. So those are the mushroom columns in that block, which is the last floor, which the same mushroom becomes taller than holds a slope roof. And it opens up all to the gardens and the green on the outside. The upper levels, and then the last block, which became a multi-purpose studio block, which gets divided into two studios each. Entire thing is sliding openable panels, which open up the entire space to the outside. Upper levels are all decking sheets, which then become drywall construction sitting on masonry at the lower level. And those are the trusses on top. And then the studio's kind of spaces open up to the sides also, so that students can walk out, do their models, eat, lunch, whatever else that you want to do outside your class hours. That's the canteen at the back. And that's the drywall of the studios. Those are the studios where the spans are a little larger. In the last block, the span became almost 11 meters, double from what we started there. So the idea of continuing with the same structural members and the same structural ideas, but then looking at larger and larger spans every time you're doing it, getting bolder, getting more confident with what you're trying to do, and seeing if that idea continues. So that's block one. So actually, in terms of a plan, there's nothing much. There's just two straight blocks which hold these buildings in the middle. That's it. So there are two projects, two ideas of continuity. One talks about people, one talks about an idea which is bigger than people sometimes, much larger than the buildings itself. And sometimes you pick on those ideas to continue something, and probably it's not the buildings. Why I'm saying this is because I'm sure most of you, when you were doing the competition at Badami, the rocks and the caves would have weighed heavily on you. Now, how does one react to something like that? That we'll talk about it tomorrow. Thank you so much.